let's look at knives. One of the most basic kitchen utensils that you should have in your kitchen, and where the type, the shape, the quality makes a major difference, is your kitchen knife. Here I have a whole array of kitchen knives I use in my own kitchen for different purposes. Now, basically you don't need as many knives as this. In fact, you only need 2 or 3 knives to be really well off in your kitchen. You need a relatively large all-round chef's knife. You need a smaller knife for chopping herbs, for doing very delicate cutting or peeling. And you might also need, if you do a lot of work with meat, a butcher's knife. But for most people, you can do everything you need to do in your kitchen with just 2 knives. A larger one and a smaller one. The first thing to consider with your knife is the actual material. So the basic 3 materials or types of knives you can get are iron knives, stainless steel, which most of these are, or ceramic knives. Ceramic knives are the newest kid on the block. So they're actually made from a ceramic material. That has both advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of a ceramic knife is that it's extremely sharp, and it stays sharp. The edge is so hard that your knife won't really go dull. You don't really have to sharpen it. The downside of a ceramic knife is that it's very fragile. So if I were to drop it, it would splinter. That also means a ceramic knife is really good for cutting and chopping things that are relatively soft, but you cannot use it to hack or cut your way through very hard things, like if you have a chicken and you want to cut the thigh open. A ceramic knife would not be a good choice because it most likely would splinter. So a ceramic knife could actually be nice. Also with ceramic knives, don't put them in the dishwasher because they will go dull from it. In fact, all knives will. So when you've used a knife and you want to clean it up, never put it in your dishwasher. Wash it by hand unless you want it really dull really fast. Stainless steel is the most common material. Now, you can get various grades or qualities of stainless steel. The finer the steel, the sharper knife you can get, but the more often you'll have to sharpen it. So when you get the very high qualities of stainless steel, your knife can be extremely sharp, but you also have to sharpen it often because the steel is actually softer. That's why you can make it so sharp, but that also means that the edge will go dull somewhat faster. So for home use, I'd actually recommend you get a stainless steel knife, but do not buy the most expensive one with the way highest quality of stainless steel, because then you'll have to sharpen it professionally, or have it sharpened professionally quite often. And unless you work with cooking, work as a chef or something like that, then that will probably become too much of a nuisance. Now, there are also iron knives. I actually don't have any in my kitchen at the moment. Iron does have one advantage over stainless steel, and that is sharpness. Iron knives can become extremely sharp as well, but they also rust. So within a very short time, you'll get a quite ugly surface, and unless you dry them extremely quickly once you've used them or washed them, you'll have a problem with the knife actually giving off rust into the foods you're chopping. So if you took a rusty iron knife and cut through a lemon and then pressed the juice from the lemon, or just took a bite of the edge of the lemon where you cut it, you'd actually be able to taste the iron. So for yourselves or your patients and clients, I'd say stainless steel or a ceramic knife. Now, there are a couple of pointers beyond just the material, and one thing is actually the shape of the knife. So what you want is a knife where the blade is high enough that your fingers will not touch the table when you hold the handle. Because when you're going to chop things with your knife, if the knife is too shallow or too low, so to speak, then you won't be able to chop efficiently, because, look at this, this is a butcher's knife, so it's not meant for chopping vegetables, but I see a lot of kitchen knives and chef's knives that are this narrow or low, whatever you want to call it, and then if I were to use it, as you can see, I can't really get my fingers underneath. So if I were to chop something on the chopping board, I'd spend all the time hammering my knuckles against the chopping board, which will just become a nuisance and probably will keep you from cooking. But if you have a knife that is higher, wider, whatever you want to call it, now I can easily chop things because my fingers will not hit the cutting board. There's enough space. So for most of the knives you're going to do work with in the kitchen, you want to make sure that there's enough space for your fingers not to touch the cutting board when the edge is actually against it, against whatever surface you're cutting on. The other thing in terms of shape is that you probably also want a knife where the edge actually tapers a bit, or it's a bit round at the end, because that makes for easier movement. If the knife is completely straight like this one, it just means the ergonomics of chopping are not quite the same. So make sure that your knife is actually tall enough. You can see this one it's a lovely knife, but it's a bit too small for me, because if I actually use it to chop, my knuckles will hit against the cutting board. And obviously with the small vegetable or knife for paring vegetables, peeling lemons and so forth, that you don't have to take that into consideration, because you're not going to use it like that. Now, talking about the big and the small knife, what you also want is actually make sure that the big knife is long enough. I see a lot of people who tend to buy kitchen knives that are a bit too short, not big enough, and that becomes a problem, because when you're about to chop large things, unless your knife is long enough, you actually can't get the whole vegetable or what you're cutting underneath the knife. So as you can see with this knife, I can easily take this head of spring cabbage and cut it too. But if this was the only knife in my kitchen, I'd be in trouble. So you probably want to buy the large chef's knife for your cooking a bit longer than you expect. So in fact, go a bit beyond your comfort zone, and in the end you'll be really happy about it. Because look here, quite easy, right? But with this knife, I'm gonna have to do this, I have to do that. I won't actually be as much in control, so I had to cut several times to get through this head of spring cabbage, and in fact I didn't cut it as straight as I did with the large knife. So if you're only going to have two knives, make sure that the larger of the knives is big enough and long enough to be effective and easy to use. Now, another test actually whether your knife is up to scratch is to test it on an apple. So, and in fact, I'll just sharpen this quickly. So here I have a knife iron, which is a really handy thing to have as well in your kitchen. Because with the stainless steel knives, what you want to do is quite often, even during cooking, you just want to sharpen it quickly, not to completely change the angle of the surface, but just sharpen it with 10 strokes or so on each side. But see, a really good test, if you can more or less cut through an apple like that and get a nice even cut, then that means your knife is sharp enough. If you can't do that, you're in trouble. Now the final thing with the shape of the knife is actually, if you come closer, if you look at how the knife tapers or becomes narrower towards the edge. Here we're looking from the top, obviously from the bottom it should be very narrow from tip to end, but on the upper side or on the top side, you actually want the knife to be quite thick or fat at the end towards the handle, because that means when you're chopping things, not only will the knife slide through them, but it will actually also push things to the side. So if you look at this knife, which is in many ways a really nice knife, high quality stainless steel, but as you can see it doesn't taper as much. It's a bit too narrow, so when I use it for chopping, the problem is if I chop vegetables, I'll show you an example, it doesn't really push them to the side, and it's a bit harder to cut through the vegetables because the knife doesn't push things to the side as well. So if I were to chop this carrot and cut it into fine little cubes, as you can see, I actually have to use a bit of strength to cut through. And no, I didn't peel the carrot, it's organic, so we'll leave the peel on, but as you can see here, I actually have to use quite a lot of physical force to cut through it. And when I'm chopping here, I have to spend more time pushing what I've chopped to the side, because when you're chopping with your knife, if it also becomes thicker towards the handle, it helps push things apart when you're chopping or cutting through them, and that just means you have to use less force, and it also means that you can chop faster. So if we were to take one of my favorite knives, this one, as you can see, it's a lot easier. I don't have to use as much force. The knife almost just slides through the carrot like a hot knife through butter. As you can see, or maybe here, it's easier, and the amount of force I have to use is a lot less. Now, the tip wasn't really that tasty, so we'll get rid of that, but as you can see, when I chop here, the knife actually pushes the little pieces of the carrot to the side. And also the cubes are in fact a lot prettier than these ones. As you can see, they're more uniform in shape. So you have to look at your knife in several dimensions or several directions. Length, whether there's enough space for your fingers to actually be safely underneath the handle when you're chopping. You want the knife to be, to actually have a slight curve towards the end, not be straight. And then you want it to taper towards the end, but be somewhat thicker on the top side towards the handle. If you just make sure to keep those things in mind, then the knives you buy will be a lot higher quality and a lot easier for you to use, and hence you'll have fun cooking, because yes, we're going to cook lots of vegetables. We're going to chop them, stir fry them, steam them, bake them, broil them in the oven, boil them, marinate them, eat them raw. That means lots of chopping. But if the utensils you have aren't up for the chopping and cutting, obviously it will take time, and whatever you end up doing will not be as delicate. So those were just a few things about knives. Bon appetit.